The night was dark, and the air was thick with tension. Elvis Presley, the king of rock and roll, stood at the front gate of Graceland, his eyes blazing with anger. A former employee, Jack Leonard, was causing a scene, spewing hateful words and racial slurs. Elvis had heard enough. With a swift, powerful motion, Elvis's fist connected with Leonard's jaw, sending him sprawling to the ground. The guards stood in shock, unsure of what to do. Elvis, breathing heavily, looked down at the man he had just punched. "You ever come back here again, and I'll have you arrested," he growled. The guards quickly stepped in, helping Leonard to his feet and ushering him away. As they disappeared into the night, Elvis turned and walked back to the house, his mind racing. This wasn't the first time someone had tried to provoke him, but it was the first time he had lost his cool so publicly. Elvis had grown up poor, in a world where racial tensions were a daily reality. He had seen the struggles of black people firsthand, and he couldn't stand by and let someone use hate and prejudice to hurt others. His father, Vernon, and his mother, Gladys, had always taught him to treat everyone with respect and kindness, no matter their skin color. As he entered the house, Elvis's father, Vernon, and his younger brother, Billy, were waiting in the den. "What happened, Elvis?" Vernon asked, his voice filled with concern. Elvis sighed and sat down on the couch. "It was that guy, Jack Leonard. He was fired a few weeks ago, and he came back to cause trouble. He was using the N-word and cursing at us. I couldn't take it anymore, so I punched him." Vernon nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. "Did he say anything else?" Elvis's eyes darkened. "He said he was going to come back and cause more trouble, but I don't think he will. I made it clear what will happen if he does." Billy, who had been listening intently, spoke up. "Elvis, you did the right thing. No one should have to put up with that kind of hate." Elvis smiled, grateful for his family's support. But the incident had stirred up old memories and emotions. He thought about the times he had seen black people being treated unfairly, the times he had heard the N-word used with such casual cruelty. He remembered the joy and passion he had found in black gospel music, the way it had inspired his own performances. Elvis had always tried to use his fame to promote love and equality. He had supported black artists and incorporated their music into his own, never forgetting the roots of his success. But moments like this reminded him that the fight for justice and equality was far from over. As he sat in the den, surrounded by his family, Elvis felt a mix of anger and determination. He knew that he had to continue to stand up for what was right, no matter the cost. The world might see him as a rich, famous star, but he was still the same Elvis who had grown up in a poor family, dreaming of a better world. The night was quiet now, but the memory of the fight lingered. Elvis closed his eyes, trying to find peace in the chaos. He knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult, but he was ready to face it. For Elvis, love and justice were not just words. They were the guiding principles of his life. Elvis was a man who always kept his promises. Even when he didn't want to make movies anymore, he stuck to his contracts. The Colonel, his manager, thought 3 movies a year with soundtracks was enough, but Elvis felt like his talent was being wasted. He wanted to perform live, where he could connect with his fans in a different way. Some people say the Colonel made Elvis famous, but that's not true. If the Colonel was so good at making stars, why didn't he help anyone else become as big as Elvis? By the 1960s, Elvis had grown beyond what the Colonel could offer. He needed better management to explore new opportunities. Elvis believed that with the right guidance, he could have become one of the greatest movie stars ever. But the Colonel kept him in the same kind of movies, which limited his growth. Elvis knew it was time for a change. He wrote in his Bible, "There is a season for everything, and patience will reward you." He was ready to move on from movies and get back to live performances. In 1968, NBC gave him a chance to show the world he still had it. The special, called Singer Presence, Elvis, featured him performing in different settings. It was a massive hit, proving that Elvis still had the magic. Elvis didn't like the term comeback special, because he never felt like he was gone. He was just waiting for the right moment to shine again. After the special, he decided to focus on live shows. The most obvious place to start was Las Vegas. In 1956, Elvis had flopped in Vegas, but things were different in 1969. He booked 2 shows a night for a month at the Hilton, and it was a huge success. Elvis set a new standard for live performances, and other entertainers struggled to match it. Elvis was always the first to do things. He was the first big music star to make movies, the first to wear lots of jewelry, and the first to do an acoustic set on a small stage. He never settled for the same thing, and always pushed himself to do more. He believed in the strength and guidance God gave him, especially when he faced challenges. Elvis was more than just a star. He was a friend and a brother to those around him. People often came to him with problems, and he was always ready to help. One time, I asked him how to deal with bullies. He told me, "Don't start a fight, but don't walk away if you have to defend yourself. There's a time to be a lamb and a time to be a lion." He knew what it was like to be bullied and how to handle it. One night, I was dating a girl who had a jealous ex-boyfriend named James. James was a big football player who kept following us around. My brother Rick told Elvis about it, and Elvis decided to take care of the problem. We drove around in my car, and Elvis asked people if they knew where James was. Eventually, we found out where James lived. Elvis and I went to his house, and when James's parents opened the door, they were shocked to see Elvis. Elvis told James, "I hear you've been following my little brother around. If it happens again, I'll come back, and it won't be nice." James promised it wouldn't happen again, and his parents were apologetic. We left, and I never saw James following me again. Elvis was always there to protect the people he cared about. Elvis faced many challenges in the 1960s, but he never gave up. He believed in the advice from the Bible. Those who hope in the Lord will renew their strength. They will soar on wings like eagles. They will run and not grow weary. They will walk and not be faint. Elvis was ready to soar again, both personally and professionally. He had a group of friends and family who stood by him, and he was always ready to help those who needed it. Elvis was more than just a singer. He was a magnet for excitement and adventure. He could light up a room just by walking in. But it wasn't just his performances that made him special. It was the way he lived his life, always pushing the boundaries and making every moment count. I was lucky enough to see this side of him up close, and it changed my life in ways I never imagined. Growing up, I was always curious about the world around me. My friends were always talking about allowances, and I thought maybe I could get one too. So one day, I went to Graceland and asked Vernon, Elvis's father, if I could have an allowance. Vernon's response was quick and firm. "You can't have an allowance, but I'll get you a mower so you can mow the yards." I walked out of the office feeling dejected, but Elvis happened to be walking by. He noticed my expression and asked what was wrong. I told him about the allowance, and he laughed, already knowing how Vernon would react. "Let's go back in there and talk to him," he said. We walked back into the office, and Elvis said, "Daddy, let's put Billy on the payroll." Vernon asked what I would do, and Elvis said, "He can wash my cars twice a week." Vernon, surprised, asked how much to pay me. Elvis joked, $200 a week, but then quickly added, "No, Daddy, I'm just kidding. Give him $100 a week." That was it. I was on Elvis's payroll, and it was the start of a new chapter in my life. I didn't even realize how much it would change me. 3 years later, I joined the touring crew. Rick and David had already joined, and they kept telling me, "Billy, you gotta join us. It will be the 4 of us together." I was hesitant at first. I wanted to be a mechanic and race cars, and I didn't want to leave Memphis. But their persistence paid off, and I finally agreed. When I joined, Elvis called me up to his room. I was half expecting a wrestling match, but instead, he handed me a little black jewelry box. "Billy, it's time for you to become part of the tribe. I present you with this TCB. Wear it proudly," he said. The TCB stood for Taking Care of Business, and it was a symbol of being part of Elvis's inner circle. Elvis placed the necklace around my neck, and I was so happy that I almost cried. I had seen the other guys wearing their TCB for years, and I wanted one too, but I never asked for one. I never asked Elvis for anything except advice. Rick and David saw how happy I was and congratulated me. We ended the celebration with a group hug, and Elvis said, "There's no turning back now, Billy." Being part of the TCB crew meant being on call 24/7. If Elvis needed something, we took care of it. We made sure he had water, a cigar, or chewing gum whenever he needed it. We knew his schedule and who he was expecting to see. Sometimes he would test us by asking for a cheeseburger at 4 in the morning, just to make sure we were on duty. When we came back, he'd laugh and say, "I'm not hungry now. I just wanted to make sure you were on duty." One day, Elvis gave us a new nickname, the Wrecking Crew. From then on, whenever he wanted the three of us, there was no mistaking who he was talking about. We were a separate entity from the TCB group, and our job was to help Elvis with everything, from getting ready for a show to meeting fans. One of my most important jobs was to make sure Elvis's Bible was with him at all times. He was a devout Christian, and carried his Bible wherever he went. Being part of the Wrecking Crew taught me a lot about responsibility and taking care of others. I learned how to be more confident and how to handle the pressures of being on tour with a superstar. But it wasn't all work. We had a lot of fun too. One morning in 1972, in Vegas, it was my turn to wake up Elvis. Rick and David were in the den and they told me, "Get to work, rookie." I walked into Elvis's bedroom and said, "Time to get up, Elvis." He didn't respond. I tried again and still nothing. I went back to the den and told them, "He won't wake up." They laughed and said, "Just a rookie." Then they gave me a hard time, but finally they agreed to help me. We all went into the bedroom, and Rick and David tried to wake him up, but it didn't work. We looked at each other, and then Rick had an idea. He pointed to a vase of water on the end table. We all smiled, and I said, "Okay, let's do it." Rick threw the water on Elvis, and he jumped out of bed so fast we didn't have a chance. A wrestling match broke out, and it was chaos. We were all laughing so hard that we didn't notice the other guys from the crew running in to see what was happening. From that day on, Elvis woke up every time we tried to wake him. Elvis could be like a little kid sometimes, always thinking of ways to entertain himself and others. He was also a deeply spiritual person, and would pray before every show. He was nervous before performing, and I once asked him why. He said, "Each show is like a first date, Billy. I want the date to be perfect." I reassured him, and he smiled as he walked on stage. Another time, after he prayed, he hit me on the shoulder. I asked him why, and he said, "Hit me on the shoulder." I hesitated, but he gave me a stern look and said, "Hit me, Billy." I hit him lightly, and he said, "Is that all you have?" So I hit him harder, and he smiled. He put his arm around my shoulder, and we stood together as his entrance song played. When he stepped on stage, he turned and hit me back, then walked out into the spotlight. Elvis always believed in himself, even when no one else did. He told me, everyone needs to be self-confident. If you don't believe in yourself, no one else will either. I asked him about being discovered at Sun Records, and he said, "They didn't believe in me at first, but I stayed true to myself and followed my heart. I knew I could make it, if only given a chance." Elvis was a mentor to me, and he helped me build my confidence. He would say, "There's nothing you can't do, Billy. When you rely on God's strength, you can do anything in this world. It's not just me on your side, it's God on your side too." He believed in me, and that made all the difference. Through the years, we bonded over many experiences. I saw him fall in love, get married, and have a child. I was with him through the highs and lows. But nothing brought us closer than our shared love for fast cars. We would hop into one of his cars and drive, and those moments were some of the best of my life. Ernest Hemingway once said, "There are only 3 sports, bullfighting, motor racing, and mountaineering. All the rest are merely games." Elvis and I never faced a bull or climbed a mountain together, but we sure loved racing. It wasn't just a game to us. The love of speed, Elvis always said, is something you're born with. It's in your blood. We had countless conversations about why we loved racing. It all came down to one thing, the feeling you get when you push a car to its limits. When Elvis or I got into a car, it felt like putting on a jacket. The car became an extension of us. We could feel the engine's heartbeat, sense the tires gripping the road, and steer with precision. The steering wheel was like our eyes, guiding us in the direction we wanted to go. Some drivers use a tachometer to measure engine speed or a shifting light to know when to change gears. Not Elvis and I, we could feel or hear the exact moment to shift. It's called seat-of-your-pants driving. That was our style. People say racing is flirting with death, or it's about being in control of something out of control. Elvis and I didn't see it that way. For us, it was all about the adrenaline rush. No drug could match the thrill of the engine screaming as you shift through the gears, hit the apex just right, and fly through a corner. Only those who have experienced the thrill of racing can understand. It's like trying to explain an Elvis concert to someone who has never seen one. If you haven't felt it, you'll never know. Elvis used cars and racing to build a close relationship with me. He knew the best way to teach was through experience. When you turn 16 and get your driver's license, your world gets bigger. You can go places without asking anyone. It's the first taste of true freedom. For the first 16 years, you're around your parents all the time. But with a driver's license, you can explore the world on your own. This is where trust comes in. If your parents raise you right, they don't have to worry when you leave. This freedom helps ensure that parents raise you well. Elvis loved the independence a car gave you. He gave away many cars, jewelry, and money. He loved seeing the joy on people's faces. He knew the excitement of giving because he had experienced it himself. He wanted to share that joy with others. One of the nicknames Elvis gave me was Gearhead, because of my love for cars and motorcycles. The time I spent with Elvis constantly shaped me. He never held back his love, money, passion, or faith. He was always there, teaching and guiding me. Mario Andretti once said, "If everything seems under control, you're not going fast enough." Elvis tested this belief more than once. When he bought a Ferrari Dino, I asked if I could take it for a ride. He knew I wanted to push it to the limit. Instead, he said, "Let's go for a ride, Billy. I'll show you how fast it is." We hopped into the Dino and drove down Elvis Presley Boulevard to the entrance of I-55 South. As we hit the entrance ramp, Elvis said, "Hang on." He shifted into second gear, and we were pinned to our seats. He shifted into third, and we were slammed back again, then fourth. The G-forces eased, and we were going fast. I watched Elvis, and he smiled, shifting into fifth. I looked at the speedometer, 160 miles per hour. I joked, "I thought this thing was supposed to be fast, Elvis." He laughed. We saw a semi-truck in the right lane and moved to the left. The truck moved over too. We were still going 160. Elvis eased off the gas, but we were still going 145 when we got to the trucks. Elvis steered the Dino onto the median. Gravel hit the undercarriage. I thought, this is it, we're about to die. But he steered around the semis and got back on the highway. We both took a deep breath. The Dino slowed down. When we reached the legal speed limit, Elvis asked, "Was that fast enough for you, Billy?" "Not really, Elvis." We laughed and walked into Graceland. Racing wasn't just about having fun or narrowly escaping death. Elvis used these crazy situations to build my confidence and teach me. Before he bought his private jet, he flew commercial. One time, we needed to get to the airport in 20 minutes. Vernon asked who would drive the second car. Elvis winked at me and said, "Let Billy do it." I took the Cadillac limo with Ricky and Charlie. When Charlie finally got in, they told me, "You have to catch them, Billy, or we'll miss the flight." I floored it. We roared out of Graceland and turned onto Elvis Presley Boulevard. I couldn't see Elvis's car. I floored the gas, and Ricky and Charlie cheered me on. We cut through a gas station to turn onto Winchester Road. The limo was almost on two wheels. I continued down Winchester and reached the airport. As we pulled onto the tarmac, we saw Elvis's car. I parked next to them, and everyone was laughing. Elvis walked over and said, "Doggone it, Gearhead. Everyone said you wouldn't make it, but I knew you could. I knew you could, Billy." He smiled and gave me a hug. I guess those racing lessons I gave you paid off. We liked to go fast and usually avoided getting caught by the police, but sometimes we weren't so lucky. One time, I was working on my Chevy Chevelle at Graceland. Elvis asked, "How fast does it go?" "Faster than you want it to go." "Let's see about that." I closed the hood and we backed out. Elvis floored it and the back tires spun. We drove down the hill and out the gate. We were racing, shifting gears, and life was good. Elvis was about to shift into fourth when he slowed down. He pointed to the rear-view mirror. A policeman on a motorcycle was behind us. Elvis said, "I'll handle this." The policeman walked over and said, "Elvis." "Yes, sir." "What are you doing?" Elvis motioned to me. "This is my little brother's car. This is my little brother Billy." I leaned forward and waved. The policeman asked, "What are you doing?" "I'm showing him how not to drive this thing on the highway." We all laughed. The policeman said, "Did he learn his lesson?" I said, "Yes, sir, I did." "Okay, Elvis, just don't do anything foolish on my shift." "Don't worry, sir, I won't." We headed back to Graceland. That was pure Elvis, always protecting others. always respectful, and always enjoying life. With Elvis as my teacher, class was always in session. One night around 1971, when I was 18, Elvis, Rick, David, and I were watching TV. I asked, "Did you ever date any of your co-stars?" He smiled. "What do you think?" "Yeah, I think you did. I mean, who wouldn't? They were all beautiful." "You are correct, young one." We all laughed and started asking about his leading ladies. Elvis was having a good time being the older brother. He gave us advice on how to treat a girl. "Women are a gift from God, and that's the way they should be treated. Be protective, make them feel safe, and make them laugh. If you can do that, they will love you forever." I had never heard that before. Making a woman laugh is that important. You can bet on it, Billy. We talked for about an hour. Vernon came in and needed to talk to Elvis. He said, "Okay, boys, that's it for today's lesson. We'll talk more about this sometime." Elvis and Vernon walked away, and my brothers and I sat there, amazed. We were just starting to learn about dating. We made our fair share of mistakes. One night, a few years later, Rick and I were cruising around Whitehaven in Elvis's Lincoln Mark IV. I noticed a blue light on the floor and said, "I wonder what it would be like pulling someone over with this." Rick and I were hanging out in our car, trying to come up with something fun to do. "I don't know. It depends on who you pull over," Rick said, scratching his head. He thought for a moment and grinned. "It might be a good way to meet some girls." I laughed. "You may be right. Let's try it." For the next hour, we played cops, pulling over cars with girls. We'd walk up to their windows, but most of them just drove off, laughing and thanking us for not giving them a ticket. They probably thought it was a joke, seeing us with our long hair and all. When we got back to Graceland, Elvis was waiting for us. He didn't look happy. He told us to follow him upstairs, and we did. He sat at his desk and motioned for us to sit down. I got a call from the police. They said 2 long-haired guys were pulling over women. Elvis said, his voice serious. Rick and I exchanged a look. "That was us, Elvis," I admitted. Elvis sighed. "Did you ever think about what could have happened? You could have been shot." "We didn't think of that," Rick replied. Elvis leaned back in his chair. "I know you didn't, but that blue light is serious, guys." "We won't do it again, Elvis. We promise," Rick said. "Yeah, never again," I added. Elvis smiled a little. "Did you meet any girls?" "No, they took one look at us and drove off," Rick said. Elvis laughed. "I can see why. You thought you were Starsky and Hutch, but you look like Starsky and Much." We had a good laugh, but we learned a valuable lesson that day. Elvis was always known as a ladies' man. From his hip-shaking performances on the Ed Sullivan Show to the rumors about his affairs, people couldn't stop talking about his charm and appeal. Some of the stories were true, but many were exaggerated. The truth is, Elvis struggled with his own battles. He didn't have a different girlfriend in every city. His relationships usually didn't last longer than a few months because he was worried about common-law marriage. He didn't want to be in a position where someone could claim they were married if they had been together for a long time. Most of his girlfriends were movie stars he met in California. These relationships often started as friendships with co-stars, and then became more physical. Elvis was cautious and never got involved with anyone he didn't trust. Sometimes he would notice a fan at a concert and ask someone to bring her back to his dressing room or hotel. He would talk to her, and sometimes things would go further, but not always. Some women said they spent the night with Elvis, and he just read the Bible to them. He wanted to talk to someone who didn't want anything from him. Elvis knew he wasn't perfect. He often said, "I am not perfect, I'm far from it. There is no perfect human being except for Jesus." He struggled with his sins, just like anyone else, but he also did a lot of good in the world. He brought joy to millions through his music, and shared his faith with his fans. It's easy to judge him for his mistakes, but we all have our weaknesses. Jesus warned us not to judge others, saying, "Do not judge, or you too will be judged." When people try to judge Elvis, I remind them to think about their own mistakes before casting stones. One day in 1968, my brothers and I were with Elvis in a limo after a day of horseback riding. We were all dressed up as cowboys. Elvis said he was hungry and wanted a hamburger. We saw a place called Lotta Burger and decided to stop. The manager, Mr. Cooper, was surprised to see us and showed us to a table. As we were eating, a drunk man walked in and started yelling at the manager. Elvis stood up, and so did Red and Sunny. Elvis motioned for them to sit down and said, "I'll handle this." He walked over to the man and asked, "Is there a problem, sir?" The man squinted and realized who Elvis was. He said, "You're Elvis Presley, aren't you?" Elvis smiled. "Yes, sir, I am." He stuck out his hand. The man sneered, "Well, if it ain't Elvis Presley." He started cursing and yelling about the service. Elvis looked at the manager and said, "Sir, let this man have his food first. We don't mind waiting, and I'll pay for it." The man said, "I don't need your money, you expletive." He took a swing at Elvis, but Elvis blocked it and spun the man around. He grabbed the man by his shirt and belt and walked him outside to his car. Elvis came back inside, and we all applauded. "Way to go, Elvis," we yelled. Mr. Cooper brought our food and said, "This is on me, Mr. Presley." Elvis smiled. "Thank you, sir, but I'll pay for the food." He always tried to do the right thing and protect others. Elvis had his share of problems, just like anyone else. One of the biggest was knowing who really cared about him. He never knew if people were around because of his fame, or because they genuinely liked him. One guy tried to use Elvis to get close to Colonel Parker, Elvis's manager. He wanted to be a spy, telling the colonel what Elvis was doing. Elvis found out and paid the guy $10,000 to leave. He said, "Don't ever come around here again. If you ever see me, cross to the other side. I never knew you." Elvis felt betrayed. He compared the guy to Judas, who betrayed Jesus. It was a painful moment for Elvis, who already had a strained relationship with Colonel Parker. Elvis was a complex person. He had his flaws, but he also had a deep faith and a kind heart. He taught me to live, to love, and to put God first. He was my big brother, and I'm proud to stand up for him. The colonel always wanted more control. From the very first days, he began managing Elvis's career. He wanted to have as much say as possible, in as many things as possible. Elvis had his regrets about this arrangement more than once. One time, the two of us were driving around Memphis and passed by Sun Records on Union Avenue. In passing, I said, "That's where it all began." Elvis had made his first recording, My Happiness, there in 1953, when he was just 18. I was surprised when he responded, "I wonder what would have happened if I had listened to my mom." Elvis rarely talked about his mother, so my ears perked up and I asked, "What do you mean?" He continued, "My mom never did like Colonel Parker. Sometimes I feel like I sold my soul to the devil." When Elvis began his career, his manager was supposed to be Hank Snow, a country artist who had started his own agency. Snow had teamed up with the Colonel to create a new agency, and Elvis was supposed to sign with Snow. He was a Christian and had recorded some gospel music, and Elvis's parents were happy about this. But between the verbal agreement and the actual signing, the Colonel had changed the contract to ensure he was the sole manager of Elvis. Most of the people in Elvis's circle expressed their dislike for the Colonel, particularly Vernon, who felt that he couldn't even talk to his own son when Parker was in town. To the Colonel's credit, he was vital for getting Elvis media exposure in the 1950s. However, as time went on, particularly after Elvis got out of the Army, the Colonel's approach became more and more outdated. Other than that, the main people who caused Elvis grief were some family members who would come around now and again, asking for a handout. They didn't have any interest in a relationship with Elvis. They would only come around when they needed something. "Hey Elvis, can you help me with this? Can you give me that?" Because Elvis didn't have the heart to say no, he would help them. It was the same with the Colonel. Elvis felt an obligation to him for getting his career started, even though he knew the Colonel was taking advantage of him. But Elvis was loyal to a fault, and preferred to avoid conflict whenever possible. You could say Elvis's #1 rival was himself. He was a perfectionist who always wanted to top himself to do better. He would never listen to a song he had recorded. One time in the 1970s, Elvis and I were talking about music, and I mentioned his early stuff. I said, "I really loved all that older stuff you did back in the 50s, you know, the stuff that changed the world." He responded with a disinterested, "Yeah, what?" I couldn't believe he would shrug off his early music like that. It was the music that had given him his start. I don't listen to it. Why? I can go back and do better. If you listen to the vocals, I sound like a teenager. But you were a teenager, Elvis. Yeah, but my voice has matured a lot since then. It even got to the point later on, when he was doing concerts, where he would rush through the medley of his early songs, like Hound Dog. He just didn't enjoy performing them. Elvis didn't think anyone 40 years old should be doing those songs. He was trying to get away from that character he had created, the original rock and roll rebel, and transform into a more mature performer. As he reached his later 30s, and especially into his 40s, Elvis had less and less interest in treading water and doing the same things over and over again. He wanted to keep expanding creatively as well as spiritually. With each passing year as he got older, I could see him growing closer to the Lord. Anyone who spent time around Elvis knew that he relied on God for everything. It's where he got his strength. Elvis was so appreciative of what he had and what God had given him. He thanked God every day and constantly sought God's guidance through prayer and reading the Bible. The Psalms were especially close to Elvis's heart. Perhaps that's not a coincidence, because King David was also a musician who had his share of battles, and at times was discouraged. Elvis particularly liked Psalm 118. He had underlined verses 8 to 9, which say, "It is better to take refuge in the Lord than to trust in humans. It is better to take refuge in the Lord than to trust in princes." At the bottom of that page in his Bible, Elvis wrote a note to himself, "Trust in the Lord, not man." He knew that people, including him, were frail and fallible, but the only one he could ultimately trust was God. Elvis was also drawn to Psalm 43, which has a similar theme. "Vindicate me, my God, and plead my cause against an unfaithful nation. Rescue me from those who are deceitful and wicked. You are God, my stronghold. Why have you rejected me? Why must I go about mourning, oppressed by the enemy? Send me your light and your faithful care. Let them lead me. Let them bring me to your holy mountain, to the place where you dwell. Then I will go to the altar of God, to God, my joy and my delight. I will praise you with the lyre, O God, my God. Why, my soul, are you downcast? Why so disturbed within me? Put your hope in God, for I will yet praise him, my Savior and my God." Despite being a world-famous celebrity with wealth, talent, and looks far beyond what most people could ever imagine, he was no stranger to problems and frustrations. Sometimes they came from others, and sometimes they came from himself. In either case, he took refuge in God's word, knowing that God was the lighthouse giving him guidance in uncertain times. Maybe that is why he wrote a brief prayer at the top of this page near Psalm 43 in his Bible, "Lord, send me light to guide me." He didn't ask for God's guidance only for himself. He also wanted it for his country, which was going through tremendous upheaval in the 1960s and 1970s. Elvis was a true patriot, who not only served in the army, he also wanted the world to know how he felt about the greatest country on earth. I remember one particular discussion I had with him about America. He said, "We live in the greatest country in the world, Billy. It was founded on freedom for religious beliefs and for political beliefs in that order. Our forefathers worked hard and fought for this country. They made this country what it is today." He thought for a moment, then added, "If it wasn't great, then why do people from all over the world want to come and live here? I'll tell you why, because we are one nation under God." I asked, "Then why do I see all these people saying they don't like it here?" Elvis chuckled. "If they really don't like it here, then why don't they leave? There are planes and ships leaving this country every day. Are those people leaving?" "No, I see them almost every week, saying the same thing over and over." That's because they know they can't go to any other country and say stupid stuff about that country without fear of being persecuted. Only in America can they get away with that. The sad thing, Billy, is this: many people died for them. They died to keep us free. I sat there for a moment, taking in everything Elvis was talking about. The wheels were spinning in my head. Then I said, "The thing I don't understand is, most of these people are in college. They are supposed to be smart. Don't they read the history books?" "I'm sure they have, but they've taken God out of the equation. When you do that, you lose everything." He could see I was thinking hard about what he had just said. He smiled, then added, "That's why it's so important that your generation keeps God as the foundation of our great country, Billy. Never lose that." For Elvis, God and country were two parts of an inseparable whole. He believed in the principles the Apostle Paul taught in Romans chapter 13, verse 1-5. "Let everyone be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established. The authorities that exist have been established by God. Consequently, Whoever rebels against the authority is rebelling against what God has instituted, and those who do so will bring judgment on themselves. For rulers hold no terror for those who do right, but for those who do wrong. Do you want to be free from fear of the one in authority? Then do what is right, and you will be commended. For the one in authority is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for rulers do not bear the sword for no reason. They are God's servants, agents of wrath to bring punishment on the wrongdoer. Therefore, it is necessary to submit to the authorities, not only because of possible punishment, but also as a matter of conscience. As an 18-year-old, Elvis became subject to the governing authorities by registering for the draft, as any dutiful young man would have done. And he continued doing so, even when he was targeted for the draft. It is easy to forget that Elvis was controversial during the first few years of his music career. By today's standards, his music is tame. But at that time, his music was so different that older generations felt threatened by his new form of music. Some felt this newfangled music needed to go, even though he was doing gospel music in addition to his regular music. But they chose not to see that part, and instead focused on the music they didn't like. Elvis wasn't the first rock and roll musician, of course, but he was by far the most well-known. He was the one who brought it to the mainstream. Some conservative leaders even called him the Antichrist. A segment of society wanted him silenced because they felt he was a dangerous influence on young people. On December 20th, 1957, as he was enjoying the holidays at Graceland, Elvis received his draft notice for a 2-year commitment in the Army. Because of who he was, other branches of the military were interested in using Elvis in non-combat roles, such as recruiter or entertainer. However, he brushed those offers aside and still chose to serve as a regular soldier. His fans sent thousands of letters to the Army, asking for Elvis to be released, but he loved his country and was determined to serve his full assignment. However, he requested and received a deferment, so he could finish working on the movie King Creole, before he officially entered the service a few months later to begin his basic training. Once in a while, Elvis would share a story about his time in the service. This was one of my favorites. One day in the winter of 1970, Rick, David, and I were talking to Elvis and complaining about how cold it was. Elvis said, "This ain't cold. I'll tell you about cold. The coldest I've ever been was in Germany," he continued. "When I was in the Army, one of my jobs was to sit on a hilltop in my Jeep and watch the other guard. He was on the border on guard. Did anything ever happen?" I asked. "No," Elvis said. "I would just sit there and watch a Russian guard who was watching me." Elvis laughed and continued. "One night it was so cold, I thought he was going to freeze to death. Then I came up with an idea. I took out my poncho and placed it over myself and the Jeep, then started the engine. The heat from the engine started to warm me up. But the next thing I knew, I was lying on the ground next to the Jeep. I looked around to see if anyone had sneaked up on me and knocked me out. I walked around the Jeep, but there weren't any footprints. Then I looked at the Jeep and the poncho. I saw the poncho was covering the exhaust pipe, and I realized what had happened. Carbon monoxide had filled my poncho and knocked me out. God was watching over me that night. If I hadn't fallen out of the Jeep, I would have died on that hilltop." We said, "Thank God he was watching out for you, Elvis." Yeah, that was a close one for sure. Other than that one incident, Elvis's time in the Army was largely uneventful. He never whined or complained about being in the service. One time I asked him what he thought about the whole experience. He said, "I went and served my time, and I'm proud I did, but I didn't like the reason for it." "What do you mean, the reason?" I asked. "To get me out of the public eye. They thought I was the Antichrist, ruining the children with my music." Then he added, "If you look at my movies before I went into the Army, I was moving a little bit. But after I came out, I didn't move as much. They had the female lead do the dancing. It's true." There is a difference in Elvis's performances between his pre-Army and post-Army movies. He wasn't a rock and roll rebel anymore. Many times I heard Elvis use the phrase, "they clipped my wings," when he talked about his time in the Army. Even though the Army had changed him, and he felt he was unfairly targeted for the draft, he continued to be a strong patriot and supporter of the United States. Elvis didn't like to make statements with his music. He didn't want to include anything about politics, drugs, or otherwise controversial material. He felt that wasn't the purpose of music. He just wanted to make people feel good with his music and point them to God, That's all. He wasn't pointing fingers at everyone doing that sort of thing, such as the Beatles. I wasn't heavily interested in the political or drug messages in music, but I did catch it now and then in songs like Happiness is a Warm Gun, or Everybody's Got Something to Hide Except Me and My Monkey. Of course, neither me nor my brothers would play that kind of song in front of Elvis because we knew he would say, "What are you playing that for?" He knew we liked the Beatles. He would say, "Billy, music is supposed to be for entertainment purposes. It's not to make any political statements or sway anybody into drugs." Elvis was occasionally questioned about this, as he was in 1972, when he was performing at Madison Square Garden. A reporter asked him about his political views, and he gave the usual response, that he was just an entertainer. Anytime they asked him what he thought of other entertainers who were more outspoken about their political views, he would say, "If that's what they want to do, that's fine." Elvis may not have agreed with those artists, but he wasn't going to go public about it. He didn't believe in judging anybody. If you asked him personally, he would tell you what he thought, but he wouldn't broadcast it. Elvis Presley was more than just a rock and roll star. He was a deeply patriotic man who loved his country and believed in its values. One of the things that really bothered him was how some people seemed to take America for granted. He couldn't understand why someone like Jane Fonda, who grew up in a privileged life in America, would go to North Vietnam and pose on an anti-aircraft gun. To Elvis, it felt like a slap in the face to all the young men who had died fighting for their country. He saw it as a betrayal of the very freedom she was born into. Elvis wasn't just a hawk when it came to patriotism. He was more like an eagle. He believed that freedom came at a price, and that it was something to be cherished and protected. He respected the flag and what it stood for, and he couldn't stand it when people burned it. He often wore a lapel pin shaped like a flag, made of diamonds, rubies, and sapphires. He would say, "I wear this because I respect America, not just as decoration." When the Vietnam War was at its height, and there was a lot of anti-war sentiment, Elvis would get upset. He believed that America was a great country, and that if you didn't like it, you should leave. He once said, "I'll buy your ticket out of here if you don't like it that much. Go try that in Russia, and no one will probably see or hear from you again." He felt that the sacrifices made by soldiers were being disrespected by those who used their freedom to criticize the country. Elvis showed his respect for the military and law enforcement in many ways. Whenever he saw someone in uniform, whether it was a Vietnam veteran or a police officer, he would always stop and thank them. He even gave some of them cars or money, as a token of his appreciation. He believed that these people were heroes and deserved recognition. One of Elvis's favorite movies was Patton, and he could quote the entire opening speech by heart. The part that resonated with him the most was when General Patton said, "Americans love a winner and will not tolerate a loser. Americans play to win all the time. Now, I wouldn't give a hoot in hell for a man who lost and laughed. That's why Americans have never lost and will never lose a war, because the very thought of losing is hateful to Americans." This summed up Elvis's feelings about America, and his belief in always striving to be the best. Elvis's love for his country wasn't just about words. He wanted to take action. In December 1971, he made a spontaneous trip to Washington, D.C., with a very specific goal in mind. He wanted to become a federal agent at large, to help fight the growing drug problem in America. He wrote a letter to President Richard Nixon, expressing his concern about the drug culture and his willingness to help. He flew to D.C., checked into a hotel, and then went to the White House to deliver the letter personally. When he didn't hear back immediately, Elvis visited the Federal Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs, trying to persuade the deputy director to give him a badge. The deputy director refused, but later that day, Elvis received word that President Nixon would meet with him. When he arrived at the White House, he had to hand over his weapons to the Secret Service. Elvis, who often carried multiple guns for his safety, found this a bit amusing. He even forgot to hand over a Derringer he had tucked behind his belt buckle, which the Secret Service agent found when Elvis went to the bathroom. The meeting with President Nixon was a bit surreal. Elvis was excited to be there, and even rummaged through Nixon's desk. They discussed the drug problem, and Elvis expressed his desire to help reach out to young people. He also mentioned his concerns about the Beatles and their anti-American influence. Nixon agreed to give Elvis a badge, and they took several photos, including the famous one of them shaking hands. Elvis was thrilled to receive the badge, and saw it as a symbol of his commitment to helping his country. He was proud to show it off to everyone back at Graceland. To Elvis, the badge represented more than just a piece of metal. It was a way to show his support for law enforcement and his dedication to the values he believed in. Elvis's love for his country was genuine, and it was a part of who he was. He saw himself as just another American, doing his part to help and make a difference. Whether it was through his music, his actions, or his words, Elvis always wanted to do what he could to honor the country he loved so much. Elvis was more than just a singer. He was a man on a mission. He wanted to use his music to share a message of hope and love. He believed that everyone needed God's grace, and he saw it as his calling to help others find it. When Elvis stepped onto the stage, he poured his heart and soul into every performance. He wasn't just there to entertain. He was there to connect with his audience in a deep, meaningful way. He wanted to show them that no matter how big or small their problems were, they weren't alone. God was there, and so was Elvis. Music was Elvis's way of spreading the gospel. He didn't just sing gospel songs. He sang songs that had a message of faith and hope. When he sang How Great Thou Art or Amazing Grace, you could see the sincerity in his eyes. He wasn't just performing, he was sharing a part of himself. Elvis didn't write most of his songs, but he chose them carefully. He picked songs that resonated with his beliefs and his life. He wanted to use music to reach people in a way that a sermon or a lesson couldn't. Music touches the heart directly, and that's exactly what Elvis wanted to do. After his shows, Elvis would often stay up all night singing gospel music with his friends. It was his way of unwinding and finding peace. Music was his refuge, just like it was for King Saul in the Bible. When things got tough, Elvis turned to music to find comfort and strength. Elvis's fans could feel his authenticity. They saw that he wasn't just putting on a show. He was sharing his life. When he sang, he was telling his story and inviting others to join him on his journey. He wanted people to know that they were loved and that God was always there for them. Elvis's greatest fear was that people might miss his message. He didn't want to be remembered just as a talented singer or a charismatic performer. He wanted to be remembered as someone who used his gifts to help others find a deeper meaning in life. When you listen to Elvis's music, try to hear the message behind the songs. He wanted to share more than just entertainment. He wanted to share his heart. He wanted to show that even in the darkest times, there is always light. He wanted to remind us that we are never alone. Elvis's legacy isn't just about the music he made. It's about the love he shared. He believed that love was the greatest thing of all, and he lived his life trying to spread that love to everyone he met. That's the real Elvis, the one who wanted to make a difference in the world, one song at a time.